We're getting really close to the wine harvest season in the Northern Hemisphere. So today I thought I'd talk about some things you might want to order before the season comes up on you. The last thing you want to happen is to have your $500 or $1,000 worth of grapes come in, only to find that you're missing something critical to get that fermentation off to a healthy start, or the proper extraction that you want, or just to make the proper adjustments to the must. So hopefully some of these things will be a good reminder to you. And if you have any last minute items that I might have missed, make sure to mention in the comments below, because I'm trying to be all inclusive here, but every wine's a little bit different and every winemaker has a little bit of a different style. The first thing you're going to want to make sure you have on stock and fresh is some yeast. You can always do a wild fermentation, but it's pretty risky, and personally I'd rather inoculate with a strain of yeast that's been proven for years over. And these aren't chemical yeast, these are actually wild yeast that have just been harvested and available to us consumers. One yeast that I really like, this is D21, and it's a really reliable fermenter. It has pretty low nitrogen needs, so it usually doesn't cause any trouble, and it's usually made for red wine. A really good go-to is also this EC1118 from Lalvin, and it's like a ninja yeast. It'll ferment anything. It'll ferment up to 18% alcohol. It's technically a champagne yeast, but it's pretty much a general purpose, works for about everything kind of yeast. Now, you really want to keep those yeasts happy, so you want to make sure you have some nutrient on hand. Fermade K is a really good yeast nutrient, but if I'm going to use Fermade K, I like to also keep a little bit of DAP, so diammonium phosphate. And if you have a yeast that's really needs a lot of nitrogen, or you have a wine must that's really pretty low on YAN, so yeast assimilable nitrogen, you just want to keep a little DAP on hand, because it's a pretty easy way to reel it back if it starts to get a little bit of that hydrogen sulfide rotten egg stink from the fermentation, getting a little bit hungry, a little bit stressed out. So make sure you have that stuff on hand. And these have a pretty good shelf life, so it's not that you necessarily need to get fresh stuff, you just want to make sure that you have it. You never know what kind of values you're going to get when you get your grapes. They could be a little bit low on acid, they could be a little bit high on acid. So if they're a little bit low on acid, you're going to have to make an adjustment with tartaric acid. So I like to keep at least, it just depends how much grapes you're going to be doing, but I like to keep about a pound on hand through the wine season, and that'll usually get me through any jams or any acid adjustments, just to bring that pH down a little bit, pump up the acidity if necessary. And you always hope you don't have to, but as life is, you generally usually have to make some small tweaks there. And I'll put links to all these things in the description if you want to buy any of them. If your must is actually the opposite, so if it's actually too acidic, you may want to make a really slight adjustment in the opposite direction. So to do that, you can use potassium bicarbonate. And again, you don't want to make any radical adjustments with this, but it is what it is. Sometimes you just have to make a slight nudge to that must just to dial it in and kick off the fermentation right where you want it to be to make the wine that you want to make. This one, potassium metabisulfite, I always like to get fresh new stuff every year. So this reacts with oxygen, that's what it does, and that's why we like it. But at the same time, if it sits on the shelf for a year, it's going to get less and less reactive. So you can make the correct calculations to determine how much free SO2 that you want in your must. But if your sulfites really aren't as potent as they once were, you could end up in a little bit of trouble. And I just rather than buying this stuff in bulk, I just buy what I need for the season. And once the next season comes around, I get fresh stuff, and you can use the old stuff to make a cleaning solution. And I've got instructions for that on my website, smartwinemaking.com, if you want to check that out. This is some good stuff. So if you're making a red wine, one struggle when you're making a red wine is trying to get really good, not just color extraction, but color retention. So something that helps to bind up those anthocyanin molecules, which are the purple color molecules, is some tannin. So you can get that from untoasted oak. You can get that from just tannin powder. So a lot of these come from chestnut and different places, but this one here I like to use, it's called FT Rouge, and it's a highly reactive tannin, which really likes to bind up those color molecules. It can create a little bit more mouthfeel. And the other thing it can help is if you have some grapes that are just a little bit kind of bell peppery, a little bit herbaceous, they would call it, it can also help to reduce that in the must. And then as yet another benefit, it also acts as an antioxidant. So it gives it a little bit more shelf life, a little bit more protection against oxidation. And I don't know, I just like to, generally I'll always add just a little bit of this to the must. And I think you'll find at most commercial wineries, they're hitting the tannin powder pretty hard to get these big full-bodied reds that you're getting on the shelf. This is another one you really probably want to buy every year. If you plan on doing a malolactic fermentation, naturally it will oftentimes occur on its own, but it's another thing that I prefer to have a little bit of control over. So one of my favorite malolactic bacteria cultures is CH16 for red wine. It does well in relatively high alcohol environments, and it can also handle a decent amount of acid. So it's a pretty good clean fermenter, which is what I kind of want. I don't want like a super like crazy buttery wine, which you can get from a little bit more of a stressed malolactic fermentation. I just want to make sure that malic acid gets converted into lactic acid when I want it to, and not later on in the bottle. So I like this stuff from Christian Hansen. It's CH16, and this stuff's relatively, and it's not impossible to find, but not every place stocks this. I get mine from morewinemaking.com, and everything I list here you can get from More Winemaking. You can also get some nutrient for your malolactic bacteria. That stuff's not really cheap. It's about $20 for that little packet, which it'll do about 60 gallons. So, I mean, I guess it's not the most expensive stuff, but you really want to keep it happy. So this is like a dollar, $2, some Acti ml, just to keep that malolactic fermentation nice and happy and speed through it without too much trouble. This is an optional step. A lot of people like to use enzymes during a fermentation, especially with a red wine. And the reason you use enzymes is to really help extract all those flavors and colors and complexities from those berries. So, I mean, you'll notice if you use enzymes, whether it be pectic enzyme, or here's a little bit more of a complex enzyme, this is lalazyme EX, you'll notice those berries just getting like so soft compared to when you don't use them. When you actually press, it'll press even quite a bit farther. Now the trade-off is you usually end up with a lot more gross lees once you've pressed the wine, so you do end up having to rack off and probably don't really end up with much more wine. A lot of big wineries like to use enzymes because they might be pressed for tank space. So they can extract in 5 days what might take you otherwise, 15 days to extract. So it buys them a little bit of an option to process quite a few fermentations with maybe not quite as many fermentation tanks. And I mean, I don't necessarily use it all the time. So if my grapes are a little bit green, say you think they're just a hair underripe, sometimes you don't have a lot of control over the grapes if you're buying them from like a produce operation. I'm sometimes hesitant to use enzymes because I do have some concern that I might extract a little bit more from the seeds than I really want to. But if your grapes are looking real nice and healthy, I think it's a nice little thing to add just to get that big, juicy, full red wine that everyone's chasing as a home winemaker. This stuff, Go Firm, it's a nutrient for the yeast, but it's actually a pre-fermentation nutrient. So when you're making that yeast starter, you can use some Go Firm. And there's Go Firm Protect, there's Go Firm, I think there's a couple different kinds. I don't know that it's gonna make or break your day which one you use. It's just that you kind of wanna really strengthen up those yeasts before you throw them into that harsh wine environment with all that acid and possibly some other competitive yeast that might be trying to fight the yeast that you're putting in. So it just helps assure that you can keep that fermentation healthy. Again, a little bit less likely to run into stinking issues later on, hydrogen sulfide, things that can happen when your yeasts just are not too happy. And another thing, this is the last thing I'll mention, are you can buy your oak right now. Again, oak has a pretty, I'm not really worried about the shelf life too much. And it's nice to have some oak on hand. I mentioned I use the tannins during the fermentation. Well, you can use oak as well during the fermentation to achieve the same thing. It's a little bit more of an expensive route to get there. A lot of wineries actually prefer to use the untoasted or more lightly toasted oak because it has the more harsh and reactive tannins that will help bind up all those things. So you're basically taking, it's that kind of interesting, you take a few harsh molecules and put them all together and make this great, delicate colloidal or longer chain molecule that is much more pleasant. So it's like one of those cases where a few maybe not so good things put together make a wonderful thing. So it's nice to have some oak cubes on hand. And I personally usually prefer American oak. I like to keep a few different toast levels. I usually keep a medium and a heavy, and from there I can kind of make a blend to dial that toast level right in. And this is more for when I'm aging, but if you're going to have oak on hand, it's nice to have the toast levels that you want. Hopefully this is relatively helpful for you. Like I said, I'm sure I probably missed something that is relatively helpful during that early stage of getting that fermentation kicked off. So make sure to mention in the comments if there's anything you like to stock up on before the wine season. I'll put links to everything here, and if you click the links, it's one way to support the home winemaking channel, just so I can keep making more videos like this for you guys and help you out. And also be sure to check out my website, smartwinemaking.com. Thanks for watching.